Hey everyone, this is Anup Kumar. I'm here with Alexandra Kitson, and this is going to be episode 3 of The Second Mind, Trauma and Dissociation. I came across Alex's work on Twitter, actually. I saw a link to a paper that she authored on, it was called A Review on Research and Evaluation Methods for Investigating Self-Transcendence in Frontiers in Psychology. And I found it very interesting, so I reached out to her and she has agreed to talk with us. Let me tell you a little bit about Alexandra. She's an interdisciplinary researcher and PhD candidate studying human-computer interaction, design, and psychology at Simon Fraser University, located in Vancouver, Canada. Her research interests lie at the intersection of virtual reality, positive psychology, wearables, and experience design. Alexandra's projects are focused around studying and creating technologies that support well-being and connection. Her recent work explores the similarities and differences between virtual reality and lucid dreaming. Definitely have to touch on that, Alexandra, if we remember. And she is also the lead author of this study that we just talked about, a recently published review article on conceptualizing and measuring self-transcendence. Welcome, Alexandra.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today.
So I thought we would start off by talking about this article on and what inspired you to do this review on self-transcendence, because it's such a comprehensive look at the ways in which people before have studied transcendence, right? The methods and how valid they are. What was the inspiration behind this?
Yeah, well, for my PhD, I wanted to do something on this topic because, yeah, it's just fascinating to me reading about it. And my committee is made up of different sorts of researchers, and especially one of them thinks that it's really important that we know we define things really clearly. We know the construct that we're studying and how to measure it. And for self-transcendence, that was just not clear at all, what it means and how people think about it or measure it or study it.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to bring more clarity for myself, and that's what inspired the project. And then in the end, I had this giant table of measures and ways to think about it. And me and the authors on the paper thought it'd be a great way to share, with everyone.
Yeah. So I see. So it was as a result of this question and going about it, you came up with all of this and said, wow, we really ought to publish this.
Yeah. I guess it was inspired because in order to design technologies for
Yeah.
self-transcendence, first we need to understand what that means in the first place
Yeah.
and how
Yeah.
you would actually figure out if these technologies worked or not.
I see the same thing in medicine, especially when we talk about the mind and body in medicine. There's an idea in medicine that, we know what the body is. And it's kind of just an assumption that, of course, we know what the body is because we've been told since childhood, I guess, what it is informally, right? Through
Mhm.
pointing at our different parts and naming them. And just like that we know what the mind is, which is even much more vague than the body. And so I hear a lot of talk about mind-body problem, and it kind of reminds me of what you're saying now, which is that I don't think we know what either of these things are for sure, especially the mind, to even
Mhm.
start to begin to talk about a problem.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like we've had this issue for many, many years, like going back to Descartes and that mind-body dualism,
Yeah,
and we're still trying to figure it out.
yeah. All right, so I thought what I would do is just share the screen. Let's see if this works. Can you see this?
Oh yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So I thought I would just give the audience a brief overview of first mind, second mind, the framework, and go from there. And briefly, the idea is that the primary concept in our society is that the body, and specifically the brain situated inside the skull, produces the mind in some way. All right. And this mind that the brain produces is what I refer to as the first mind. It's this this feeling of a mind that is localized, an identity that is localized, and specifically in association with the body. And that localized identity is the first mind, right? Now, if you think about two people, then you might see, okay, here are two first minds. This is how we conceive of it in our society. Even when we watch cartoons, we see the little character with these bubbles floating out of their head, right? Those are their thoughts. Again, suggesting this philosophy of materialism that the physical structure creates this mind. And so if there are 7 billion people on the planet, we might say there are 7 billion first minds or human first minds on the planet. Now, the other perspective is that there is something called a second mind, which is this broader mind in which partial representations of identity appear. So the two bodies that we're seeing in this picture are representations of a broader mind. Or in this conversation, Alex and Anoop are representations of a broader mind and subtler identities. Right? So this doesn't contradict the first mind perspective or the materialist perspective necessarily. It just says that the first mind perspective is, let's say, radically incomplete, and there's much more to what's going on than this first mind perspective. And so even if we switch perspectives and we're watching a football game, we would say, well, this entire football game with tens of thousands of people attending are a frame of experience within this broader second mind in which there are tens of thousands of people, tens and thousands of first minds participating, right? So this is the overall framework of the first and second mind. And you might see that now there are implications for association and dissociation here. So dissociation on one hand could be dissociating from the body and living within just this mind context. But dissociation from a second mind perspective could also be dissociating from the second mind and living only as the body context, only as the first mind context. So I think one of the reasons I bring this up is because I think the concept of association is missing in a lot of the conversations that I'm seeing, including in psychiatry and psychology, because we always talk about dissociating from the body, but we might also consider that that itself is actually a form of association if we can include the body and the other ranges of mind in that picture. So that's the overall idea of the first and second mind frame. And I thought in that vein, I might just jump right into it and read a few passages from your paper. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's
Okay,
jump right in.
fantastic. So here, you and your authors wrote, self-transcendence can be regarded as a psychological state, personality trait, developmental process, value orientation, motivation, and worldview. It's also considered multifaceted in itself, composed of mindfulness, flow, self-transcendent emotions, peak experiences, mystical experiences. Therefore, depending on the discipline and focus, one will find very different approaches to investigate the phenomenon of self-transcendence. I was wondering if you could tell us more about that. What did you come across in terms of how people were defining this and approaching this?
Hmm. Yeah, I think we sort of saw a lot of different fields and disciplines looking at self-transcendence. They
Yeah,
might not call it that,
yeah,
but they're all kind of talking about the same thing.
yeah.
So, yeah, trying to sift through that literature and find like where the connections were was really interesting. I found that there were sort of three main sort of lenses that people, or at least researchers, looked at self-transcendence, and
Mhm.
that was conceptual and phenomenological and physiological.
Okay.
So yeah, in terms of conceptual, um, it was more about like, I guess, how self-transcendence is more like a personality trait, how people like live their life, a lot of like Maslow's conceptualization of self-transcendence is sort of around that. And then in terms of phenomenological, that was more of like states of being, a lot of like self-transcendent emotions like awe or wonder.
Hmm.
Um, then also self-transcendence in terms of like what happens in our bodies and how we measure that through like brain imaging or like other physiological measures.
So conceptual, physiological, and phenomenological. Is that right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So what do you think about, like, when I think about conceptual, the way I think about like what a concept is, it's basically like if you imagine a human being like a baby going around gathering these experiences, and at some point this baby grows up and starts to learn that how to put ideas together, and this is kind of the birth of concepts, right? Like based on
Mhm.
those experiences. So the way I perceive it is that you have a conceptual framework is actually a modification of phenomenology or of phenomena, right? A concept is a particular subset of phenomena. And same thing for physiology. Like physiology is, again, we have certain experiences, including visual perceptions, auditory perceptions, and then conceptual perceptions. And when you put those together in a certain way, we get what we call physiology.
Mhm.
So would you say that those three are independent, or do you see, what do you think about that idea that conceptual and physiological are modifications of phenomenology?
Yeah, I would say that's true. Like they're definitely not separate. They're
Okay.
very much interlinked. Like,
Okay.
you can't just have an experience and it not have some sort of link to your physiology and like how you understand the world and your beliefs and all these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely
And
related.
and then, like, what was your, I imagine you and your authors, you're saying all the stuff about self-transcendence. Did you as the authors come across something where you said, well, this seems like a good way to define it? Is there a best way?
Yeah, I think that's probably David Yadin and his colleagues
Uh-huh.
probably best defined it
Okay.
as a decreased self-salience and an increased connection
Hmm.
to like the world and others.
Okay.
That seemed to be like the one definition that tried to like capture most of the stuff. But yeah, of course, there are many other definitions.
Decrease self. So decrease self-salience in this, and there by self we mean the individual self,
Yeah, the individual
the
self, like
individual
the
self,
ego self.
the ego self, and increase connection with others. So that's kind of a middle ground between the first and the second mind, where there's a decreased first mind self, and because of that, maybe there's more room in our view for other selves to populate. It sounds like, right? Something like
Yeah,
that.
totally.
Okay, got it. All right. So, and then how about for yourself? Like, did you personally think that, okay, this is what self-transcendence is to me? Or are you playing with all of these definitions together?
Yeah, to me, I guess I'm still playing with it, but
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested in self transcendent
Okay.
emotions
Okay.
and how we could support and elicit those emotions with technologies. Yeah, also just self transcendence as a way of being and living and interacting with people in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, after reading Scott Barry Kaufman's book Transcend, um, yeah, I thought he really nailed it. What self transcendence means as a way of being.
Hmm. I'd have to read that. Scott Barry Kaufman.
Mhm.
Okay. I will check that out. And then, so here you said self-transcendence is measured differently depending on the theoretical lens used to define it. Self-transcendence as an emotional state seems to be the most widely used according to our review. So when we talk about self, like as we talk about self-transcendence, what is the self?
Yeah, I mean, that's another question in itself.
Yeah.
What is the self? I guess in terms of self transcendence, that self, I think, is like how you identify with yourself as like separate from things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, probably like from when you first start developing and getting a sense of like boundaries in the world, trying to figure out how to navigate, that
Yeah.
becomes stronger and stronger. And
Yeah. So
um,
like a sense of identity.
mhm.
Hmm. So if,
Like this is me when I think of it like mentally, but also me as like my somatic self, my body self.
got it. Okay. And then One review on the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that may mediate the effects of self-transcendence comes from Yadin et al. That's the one you referenced, right? Yadin.
Yeah. Mhm.
Who conceptualize self-transcendence as having two major components. Okay, this is what you said: loss of self and increased connectedness. So this is
Mhm.
fascinating. When I hear this, let me see if I can show this image again. So loss of self. So like, for example, in this, so here's one self, right? Here might be one identity. Here's another one. So if the sense of identity here is very prominent, then it would obscure other first mind identities, like other people in the world. And this might be what's talked about as selfishness, maybe, right? When the individual self is, it's interesting, it's selfish. It's kind of like a self.
Mhm.
So selfish behavior would be kind of like a self that's focused on here and crowding this out. And he says loss of self. So basically a diminishing of this, thereby making room for the other first minds, like other people essentially.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is that I'm sure you're aware of this in many wisdom traditions, this broader second mind is recognized as the self, as or a self, either the self or a self, such that there's this polarity of the self of a kind of more unified, subtle self, and the differentiated many selves that would be, for example, the human population. So here, loss of self and increased connectedness, to me, as we said before, seems to be kind of a middle ground between
Mhm.
just the individual view and, on the other hand, just the big picture view. Is that what you meant by absorption? I remember you were talking about pathological states and you mentioned absorption. What does absorption refer to? You said several measures only consider the positive aspects of self-transcendence and exclude the dark side, including absorption, suggestibility, and dissociation, which can have psychotic outcomes.
Mm.
I have an idea, but I wasn't sure what you meant by absorption.
Yeah, I think absorption here, referring to that McDonald and Holland paper, and I hope I'm not misquoting them, but it's like I think absorption of yourself and other. That's how I sort of see it.
Absorption of yourself in other or and other?
And other, like as you're losing your sense of self, it's I imagine it as sort of like diffusing, like yourself is diffusing,
Uh-huh.
and there's other, and it's sort of coming together, and so I guess you could be absorbed into that.
I see. That's really interesting. It reminds me of, and you mentioned this too somewhere, you talked about depersonalization and derealization and how, like the depersonalization is being outside of an individual identity or losing identity reference point, perhaps with the body.
Hmm.
And derealization is similar, but with regards to the world. And what's interesting to me is growing up is I heard similar descriptions as talked about as being part of the process of growing up, that this is what happens to the human being as the human being grows, is
Oh,
that
interesting.
the sense of identity, something like what you said, it becomes diffuse, and the sense of the world becomes diffuse, and even that line that differentiates internality and externality, that line is recognized itself as kind of like a projection or like an apparition.
Hmm.
And so the reference points can change, internal, external, like I'm not sure how you, so on my screen right now, I see you on this side and me on this side, and there's a line in between, right? So
Hmm.
it's almost like that line dividing, let's say, internal and external, it can be shifted to reduce internality and increase externality, or shifted the other way for an expanded internality and less externality, or it can just be seen through such that there is no internal external distinction.
Hmm. Yeah.
And those, interestingly, were considered part of the process of growing up, which is interesting. So
Hmm.
to me, it kind of speaks to the difference between depersonalization and depersonalization disorder, or
Hmm.
derealization and derealization disorder. I was wondering if you came
Right.
across anything like that.
Yeah, definitely, especially in my work with virtual reality. Um, there's this, I guess, worry that people will become too addicted to the virtual space and just be in that space and
Mhm,
start to dissociate from the real world.
mhm,
And there are some studies that have shown that it could be possible.
mhm,
So, definitely something to keep in mind. In terms of like self transcendence, I talk about it as like a really positive thing, but yeah, there is sort of that danger of like taking it too far sometimes, or
yeah,
getting stuck in that state.
yeah. I think for me, one of the things I look at when I hear this phrase self-transcendence is that I look at all the, maybe not all, but at least several definitions of self, or several ways to define it. Like first mind, and you can have community self, you can have a nation that is self, even at a soccer game or a football game between two teams, you can have two selves, right? You have these like
Hmm.
two large identities. Then even this broader potential nature, this, let's say, a second mind self. And to me, I guess transcendence would be being able to move among this sea of selves and not being restricted to one,
Mm.
right? Not, and that kind of, so transcending all definitions of self and not just
Hmm.
transcending this self, because then you can get caught in another self and not have access to a very useful self. It would be nice to cheer for a team, for example, right?
Mm, true.
And
Hmm.
so I find that to be, I didn't see that. I haven't seen that kind of definition of self. I was wondering if you came across that in your research.
Probably in some ways, people talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, so it's nice that you've articulated that so nicely. But yeah, I think self transcendence is, yeah, transcending not only your like ego I self, but also just, yeah, any kinds of selves,
Yeah.
because we're not just one self, we're
Yeah.
multiple selves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that
it's
makes sense.
in the conversations that I'm seeing, I'm having similar conversations like this. It seems to be a way of really collaborating, among different disciplines, is this kind of definition of transcendence, because otherwise it's very restrictive. And then there's like a spiritual side, and there's a scientific side, and there's an experiential side. And so maybe we can talk about that. I had noted this as well. So Koenig postulates, is it Koenig or Koenig?
I think it's a German name,
Okay,
Koenig. Yeah.
Koenig. Koenig postulates that the term spirituality is often conflated with general good mental well-being or health. This is problematic both because the construct should be distinct and because this definition deviates from the original meaning of the word. And this goes back to, I think, what you said in the beginning with regard to the importance of defining our terms.
Hmm.
And I wonder what you came across in this, because certainly when you start talking about self-transcendence, spirituality is top of mind. So when you did your research, how much of it was quote unquote under spiritual studies and how much of it was pure science? What's your take on those labels?
Hmm. Yeah, it was tough navigating that. Yeah, self transcendence, I think, suffers from that same thing, like under the term like spirituality. What does that
Yeah,
mean? It means so many different things to people.
yeah,
Um, Even like now, meditation or mindfulness, like
yeah,
from the original intentions of that term, it's changed quite a lot, especially in Western culture.
yeah.
So yeah, it's very important, I think, to come back to what it meant to other cultures and where it originated, and see how that's changed over time, and does it still make sense.
What's your
Um,
take on that, on spirituality, as opposed to maybe science, or like what is spirituality, or what's a definition you might have used?
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Well, I don't really like to separate the two. I think people often view spirituality as this sort of woo-woo thing that it isn't like true, and it's not like debatable, or you can't prove things the way that the scientific method thinks about it. But I think that's a shame, because it has a lot to offer about human experience, that I think our current way of doing things, at least in science, just it can't really get there.
Yeah,
So yeah, it'd be great to bring all these different viewpoints together and start thinking about it in different ways, rather than just from our narrow viewpoint of
yeah,
science.
yeah. Yeah, I wrote down several words after that paragraph when you were talking about spirituality, like spiritual, mystical, meditation, and mindfulness, as you mentioned. And to me, when I think about spiritual, at least the way that I might use a word or experience a word, it's really looking at phenomenology. Like spiritual to me is phenomenological investigation is spirituality. And if there's no investigation, and if you aren't comparing your results with yourself or with other people might be experiencing, then there's no process happening. It just becomes, beliefs, just like anything else. And to me, it's very similar to science in that sense. Like science doesn't generally begin with pure phenomenology. It usually begins with abstractions derived from phenomenology, like, for example, measurements of weight or height
Mhm.
or color, frequency. These are initially present themselves to us as phenomenology, as something that we experience, and then we comparing one perception to another, and we come up with, for example, inches or centimeters or these kinds of measurements. So science begins a little bit further down the track of phenomenology, having labeled it as something like, size or weight, whereas spirituality begins with phenomenology itself, like what are the things that we haven't named yet. And so there are a lot of new words in spirituality.
Mm.
And I find that, especially this term woo woo, you mentioned the term woo woo, what it really describes is it describes a set of phenomena that we haven't yet had a common label for. And so
Mhm.
it literally creates this feeling of woo, because the mind has not given it a particular track yet. And
Mhm.
so I think exactly that. And this happens with, same with the word mystical. I mean, what is something mystical? It's basically something that is mysterious to me that I haven't experienced. If
Mhm.
if 7 billion people are experiencing it, it's no longer mystical, right?
Yeah.
If 3 billion, probably not mystical. 1 billion, probably not mystical. If you get to 1,000 people out of 7 billion, then maybe it's mystical at that point, because billions don't recognize it. So I feel like that kind of approach we need more, just like you said, where it's like, well, let's just, if these are experiences, what are the ways in which we can experience them and describe them so that we can all talk about them?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
And then you mentioned neural correlates of consciousness. I think that would be really interesting for the audience to learn about. So, can you teach us what neural correlates of consciousness are?
Yeah, because it wasn't clear to me either how all of these things come together. So I made
Okay.
in the paper this
Okay.
flow chart to try and make sense of it a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then just before this was published, there was another paper that came out. And I think they did a really good job too of looking at all the neural correlates of self-transcendence.
Okay.
But in a nutshell, um, what seems to be happening is in our brain, there's these higher order functions of like awareness and decision making, things we can like concentrate on, and this can activate this neurotransmitter uh, that sort of relays sensory information to our brains, and that pathway also has another bunch of things that it's doing, and it blocks a signal to this one part of our brain called the parietal lobe, and that's involved in like how we perceive our selves and our bodies in space, and sort of like our self other boundaries, like, okay, I know my hand is here and there's a cup here and there's like this boundary between them. So that's what normally happens. And so the signal's getting blocked to that. So that sort of boundary between self and other starts to get wavy. And this, 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 inhibition of being able to tell the boundaries of ourself leads to this feeling of self-transcendence, like you're not totally just separate. Um, and like you said, when that boundary starts to fade away, then there's space for the other to come in, and so you start to feel this sense of like oneness with the world. And um, that, I think, over time can even lead to other things, like feeling like you're part of the world, and so you want to help the world, so you start recycling more or something like that.
And you mentioned, I think in the study somewhere, that the brain can respond to these experiences too, meaning that there are changes in the brain of people who experience this.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some like brain imaging studies where people are shown like a really amazing like mountain view, or they're shown like outer space, and that gives them like a sense of awe or something. um, and also other studies like with psychedelics and dissolving like the self other boundaries. So all of these different kinds of flavors of self-transcendence seem to be doing similar things in the brain.
And are these all somehow involving the parietal lobe, or are there other areas of the brain that are also, I mean, I'm sure it's an overall effect, but is it mainly focused in the parietal lobe?
Yeah, I think that's tricky. I don't know. I feel
Okay.
hesitant to say like it's one part of the brain, or maybe that's just part of the pathway,
Yeah.
but probably like the thalamus and the prefrontal cortex as well.
Okay. All right.
And then there's also um, like the chemical side of things,
Mm-hmm.
and like the vagus nerve, for example, can also lead to feelings of connectedness, and like oxytocin and vasopressin too involved
And
in
all of
that.
those they're connected with, like vagus nerve is known as activating the parasympathetic system and the
Hmm.
relaxation system, and oxytocin is associated with the feeling of connection, secreted with mother and baby, also oxytocin.
Exactly.
Um,
Hmm.
all right.
It's all connected.
So are they
Yeah.
seeing increases in oxytocin with these feelings of awe and connectedness?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then broadly, neural correlates of consciousness would be, let's say, physical findings that we're finding in association with the brain that relate to states of consciousness,
Hmm.
right? So it's kind of this bridge between subjective and objective experience.
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
And I think that's a big phrase now. That's one of the ways that I'm seeing that we are trying to approach consciousness through science, because consciousness seems to be a subjective phenomenon. So first is to look at where are the bridges in which it connects with physicality. And that's what these neuron firings and certain hormones and regions like the parietal lobe are coming into play.
Yeah, for sure. There's a recent review article this year that talked about neuroimaging of consciousness of self.
Okay.
And I haven't got through it all yet. It's
Okay.
like 40 pages.
Oh,
So,
can
but
you
that's
email it
by
to me? I want to check that out.
Frewen, Frewen,
Okay.
and colleagues. It's 2020.
Okay. I will check it out. And then a couple more things I want to ask you about. So you wrote, self-transcendence seems to be emerging in several disciplines, including nursing theory, developmental psychology, gerontology, personality theory, and psychiatric genetics, positive psychology, and others.
Mhm.
So what do you see as the significance of this, or like what is this suggesting that we're seeing this? I mean, self-transcendence, which might be considered spiritual or woo, as you said before, and now these what we call legitimate sciences are really looking into this.
Mhm.
So, what do you see as the significance of it, and also how do they talk about it? Do they call it self-transcendence? Because I imagine that might be frowned upon in a, like an academic kind of circle.
Mhm. I think more and more it's becoming accepted,
Okay.
like with more books being published and
Yeah.
more research being done with it. So that's good news. But yeah, certainly, like it's called different things. Like, yeah, they might talk about like dissociation from the self. It's more feels more clinical term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, not so much maybe mystical transcendence sometimes.
Yeah.
Or just talking about like connection or loss of self. I
Yeah.
see a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice that
Yeah.
it's in nursing because, or also in gerontology because it's being used as a sort of framework to think about like death and transitioning into hospice and
Yeah.
how people deal with that
Yeah.
and accept it.
And it's interesting from a second mind perspective when we talk about death, if we're appreciating multiple selves or like this, this structure of cells, death is with respect to one kind of self. It's
Mm.
not necessarily the death of identity or the death of experience, it's the death of an experience of one kind of self. And so
Mhm.
certainly that would have dramatic implications for even, for example, clinically, what we talk about end of life care. If it's not end of life, but simply end of one experience care, right? Or end of
Mhm.
oneself kind of care, that really opens up how we think about living and dying.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's great to see that like more clinicians are looking into self transcendence
Yeah.
and using it in their practice.
And then certainly your area of interest, I'd love to hear about this. Recent developments in virtual reality have provided an opportunity to create realistic experiences that can support self-transcendence. Thus, moving forward, we might use this technology as a way to further explore self-transcendence. So, how are we using VR to
Hmm.
induce self-transcendence?
Yeah, VR is really interesting because it like I don't know if you've tried it before.
I've tried. So my son has a couple of these where you put the goggles on, and then you're like swimming in the ocean, and you can see different kinds of fish and sharks. And I did one where it's like a snowball fight. It's
Hmm.
snowing, and then you go, and I definitely experience that you can feel shift in self, shift in identity. Once you
Hmm.
really let the other identity go, especially if you want to, if the intention is there, you can get into the new environment, and then taking it off, it's like, oh, it's like another frame of space time.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, it's a time dilation with VR for sure. But yeah, you like you've pointed out, like it totally shifts how you see the world and yourself, and it's really immersive. And even though you know, like, okay, this is my living room, um, the visuals around you and the sounds and the story and you being part of that, like, really puts you there in that virtual space. And we saw the opportunity to like further study self transcendence because of these properties. One is like, self transcendence sometimes is only elicited from really extreme things like taking psychedelics or near death experience or like going to the top of Mount Everest or going into space. Like these aren't things that are easily accessible. But with VR, you can program all that in. So you can make whatever world you want, and you can have people interact in that world. So that we thought that was like one opportunity to look at self transcendence, like giving people the conditions to like maybe support it better.
Mhm.
It's not like a drug that yeah, you're definitely gonna have something happen. But I guess it lays the foundation for it to maybe come up.
Yeah. So that's what I was wondering. So if a person experiences, let's say, awe through
Hmm.
VR, and then they take off the headset and they are back to this frame. Now, does a feeling of awe persist, and is it relatable to this frame of experience, or is it associated strictly with the VR frame?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Does it just stay in VR and then you take it off and you're done?
Yeah.
So we're doing studies with that to look at like what are the potential pro-social benefits after VR. And we are finding that, if you go into VR and have this awe experience afterwards, you're going to show like more helping behavior. You're going to just generally feel more positive and more connected, feel more creative, and your sense of self, which we measured by getting people to draw themselves, um, is smaller than as if you didn't experience that.
Hmm. So
So
I
yeah, it
think,
has real world. It
yeah.
has effects after, for sure.
So I think the endpoint of that would be, or might be, if in a VR experience we experience that awe and self-transcendence, and then we come back to this world, and then we can experience the awe here in
Hmm.
this world, then ultimately we can use VR as a training, right? As like a training center or a training world. However, with the intention built in that the goal is to wean off of the VR and to experience
Yes.
that
Hmm.
transcendence here, right? Are you seeing that? That's my concern when I hear about VR is, even now with smartphones, the tendency to get lost in the screen experience is, let's say, X. That's going to be several fold more, several X in a VR experience just because of the immersion and the dulling of whatever's not working in this frame of experience.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I think it brings up a good point about, how we don't want this to make another like thing you're dependent on.
Right.
Rather, yeah, we should design for like slowly transitioning away, and this is just a tool to help you get there.
Yeah.
Just like you would read a self-help health book or something.
Yeah.
VR could be like a way to jumpstart that journey. And I don't really see a lot of VR designs that are that way.
Yeah.
Probably because a lot of the designers initially were coming from like mobile games and things like that
Yeah.
that are leached in.
That seems to
Yeah,
also
it's
be the,
changing.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, oh, it's changing. So more and more people from other disciplines, like from theater and storytelling
Uh-huh.
and from medicine, are getting more involved in VR.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope that that gets built in, because if that gets built in with that intention to kind of give a glimpse of what is possible. And by the way, that also, it has deep philosophical implications, because if through VR we are experiencing transcendence, then the question is, what are we transcending to within VR? So
Mhm.
if we transcend here in this frame, we can say, okay, there's like a deeper experience of life. But in a VR world, if we're transcending, first of all, identity is getting loosened because we're going from this character to the VR character. And then if that even gets loosened and we're transcending that, that suggests that there's that broader mind of there's like a VR mind
Mm-hmm.
into which we are transcending. So what does that suggest about this frame?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
A question we haven't answered yet.
Yeah. Any thoughts or questions or anything from your side? I know I've asked you a lot.
Yeah, great questions. It's a good preparation for my defense next week.
Oh, might it actually be related to this, you think, these kinds of questions?
Yeah, probably.
Oh, wow. All right.
um, yeah, I have one examiner, I think, who is in VR and self-transcendence and self and medicine. So
Oh,
should
wow.
be interesting.
Wow. All right. Well, if they're interested, you can share the conversation with them after you successfully defend your position.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Thanks, Alex, for being with me here today.
Yeah, thank you.
And people can get in touch with you. I can see your email address is there and your Twitter handle is there. And your
Yeah.
website is also alexanderkitson.com, right?
Yeah, everything's the same name.
All right. Great.